Tyler, man, thank you so much for coming on the show here today. Really excited to have you on. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Appreciate the opportunity. Like I said before, this is awesome. So my background in related to the show specifically, I spent time for 2.5 years with F-35 fighter pilots running human performance. This was in Vermont at a squadron up there. Prior to that role, I spent a year working in undergraduate pilot training, which I know we'll get to in a little bit, but that's the first stage of fighter pilot and general pilot training. So I did that for a year, and that's been my experience in the military for about the past 3.5 years. And then prior to that, spent a lot of time in the strength and conditioning world, not dissimilar from really all these guests that you've had, where we get started at kind of a gym or working as a personal trainer. For me, it was CrossFit specifically, but same
Yeah,
concept. And then you go, a lot of people, go to graduate school, want to learn a little bit more. You then take that knowledge, want to work with some higher level athletes, Division I, professional, elite high school, whatever that sort of entails for you personally. And then I had the good fortune, I think, to work in corporate wellness for a while, which gave me a really nice perspective on managing big contracts, which in the military is not an underrated thing. You have to learn how to balance all these competing interests. And
sure.
I actually worked for a company selling strength and conditioning software as well. So got some time on the tech side of things and working as a salesman, which again was really nice. You see later on how a lot of these pieces tie together, but working in sales teaches you how to have a conversation. And a lot of what we do, which you've
Yes.
talked about before, which is really valuable, is you're not just teaching people how to move and how to think about shapes and patterns, but you have to sell yourself, especially going into a
For sure.
situation within the military where you have a lot of contracts and you show up and you say, hey, I'm here to make your population better. Well, how do you do that? You're selling them. So I've had somewhat of a diverse background, but I feel really lucky to have had those unique opportunities along the way.
I love it, man. I love it. So let's go even further back. I would love to hear, how did you get started in physical preparation, strength and conditioning, whatever you want to call it? How did you get started in this whole thing to begin with?
Yeah, again, not dissimilar. I was an athlete growing up. I always really enjoyed that. And I think the bug for me really came when I got into CrossFit. So I was 21 or 22. My uncle owned a CrossFit gym and I was able to intern for him, which was really valuable. And having spent time in that CrossFit world, it really opened up my eyes to this understanding that in sort of, I'd say, classical strength and conditioning per the NSCA is you have all these competing interests, and there's kind of this rule based that if you're chasing hypertrophy, you're not going to trace strength as
Mm,
much, or you're making a trade-off, right? It's
right.
sprinting speed versus running a marathon as an easy example. And
Right.
I got into CrossFit, and CrossFit athletes kind of do everything really well, and it's
Yeah.
really interesting to observe that population. And they'll run a 5-minute mile, and then they'll go run a half marathon at a competitive time, and they'll squat 500 pounds, and they'll do 40 body weight pull-ups. And so that was the first real inkling for me personally. I'd always been interested in sports. I'd always liked training, and I liked seeing what the human body was capable of, and specifically the adaptation piece, just how people can change over time. As we know, you can take someone and double or triple their strength in a year or two, and that's for an untrained individual, of course, but
Sure.
that's an amazing and very underrated thing, actually. Like, if it wasn't so obvious, we would be blown away by it. You can drastically improve someone's physical capabilities, and I love that. And CrossFit's where I got that bug because I saw it in myself. I got really strong. I'll never touch that strength again. When you're
Right.
young, I'll never get there again. But it was
Sure.
amazing to see in myself, and then training other people, it was amazing to see that. So that adaptation piece I loved a lot, and CrossFit specifically, just seeing what was on offer because they kind of broke the rules, and I loved being a part of that at that time in my life.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And then talk to me, because today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic in training fighter pilots. But how did you get started in that space and working with that population? Like, I know you said you got a couple steps on your journey, but how did you specifically end up there?
Yeah. I always knew I wanted to work with the military personally. I was never someone who wanted to go more the collegiate route or work with more of your traditional athlete. That just wasn't for me. I don't have a lot of interest personally. Like I was telling you before, I listened to Lauren Landau about a year ago, and he's talking about
Hmm.
all this continuing education that he's doing.
Yeah,
And,
he's a
the
savage.
force plates and the sprinting mechanics, to be honest, that was never my thing. I appreciated it, but I was not going to jump and just be into that world. But I love the military community because some of that comes together, but I just really like the concept of I describe the military to people as it's the ultimate team playing the ultimate game. And I love that idea of what military and tactical athletes had to do. So when I was a young coach, I wanted to work with Navy SEALs because that's who everyone knows of Navy SEALs.
Right, for
the
sure.
Navy's done an amazing job of marketing. Unbelievable. Everyone knows of Top Gun and everyone knows of the Navy SEALs, and no one knows of anything else. And kudos to the Navy. So I wanted to go with the Navy SEALs personally. And as I got further along in my career before the military, some of these other opportunities started popping up as far as, oh, this is a population and this is a population that I didn't know. But I'll be totally upfront. The Air Force was never really on my radar because I didn't know it existed, which is one of the reasons I'm so happy to be here. I didn't know that fighter pilots needed training. I, like everyone else, knew fighter pilots through the world of Top Gun. And you see the tradition and the highlights, and it's all really fun. But I didn't know the specificity of it. And so when the opportunity came for me to work within the military, I was actually working in corporate wellness at that time. And I alluded to before some of the contracting piece. And so that worked as a really nice segue to come from a world where you're dealing with a lot of contracts and people having to work with money and some of the realities of contracts that you deal with. And the Air Force opportunity opened up for me. And specifically, that opportunity was about building human performance for the first time ever. It had not been done before. So I was a part of a team to build human performance within the first stage of that training. And that lent itself well to me because I like new things. I don't like being micromanaged. So I'm definitely someone who needs, like, here's what I want, and then be free and be creative and accomplish it. Yeah. And we were given that freedom there. And also my kind of first real job in the industry after the CrossFit gym owned by my uncle is I was given the opportunity to kind of found a CrossFit gym. It was Jab CrossFit in Seattle, Washington. And I did that for about 2.5 years. And you get to build something, and it's so much fun, and the freedom of it. It's obviously difficult, but the freedom of that, and you get to work with people. And I had a great mentor at the time. And so kind of all of that for me came together in being able to work with the military. And so when this Air Force job presented itself, I knew it checked a lot of boxes that were interesting to me, to include just being in a tactical setting. But I'll be upfront, I didn't know specifically what it entailed. And once I figured out what it did entail, then it just became something that I felt like I really had to pursue.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And again, I've got so many questions about this because when you reached out, just for all the listeners, I get pitched all the time. There's so many services now that are pitching me, hey, bring our speaker on. They're great at this. And literally like 99 out of 100, delete, delete, delete. But when Tyler reached out, I was like, yo, this sounds like really cool because I've never heard of somebody working with fighter pilots before. I'm sure there are other people now, but there was nobody on my radar. So I think I'd like to just start with this because whenever I do a show like this, I take it from this very beginner's mindset approach because I know nothing about it, right? So I would love to hear from you. What are some of the physical tools that it takes to become a fighter pilot? Is there an archetype? And I'm going to give you an example because in basketball right now, hey, if you could be 6'6", long arms, 210 pounds, you're relatively strong, powerful, explosive, that would be like the prototype, right? Or the archetype. What does that look like for a fighter pilot? Or is there one?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I would say as a general rule, there's not one, only from the perspective of, as a fighter pilot, you're sitting down. So you have to fit in the cockpit as a reality. Right. Like you can't be too big. You obviously can't be too small as well. So some of the women will deal with this, some of the female fighter pilots as well. So there's a weight limit, there's a height limit. But in general, as long as you kind of fit in the cockpit, you're going to be okay. So from a classic archetype per your basketball example, we don't have anything like that as a fighter pilot. I will say that some of the commonalities among fighter pilots physically are that they kind of have to reach a certain level of strength. So I think it's an archetype from a minimal threshold perspective that needs to be accomplished as opposed to like a height and weight differential. And what I mean by that is the specific demand of being a fighter pilot, just to take a step back from your question and then to dive into it. The specific challenge is that you're dealing with G's, and G's are the force of gravity. And they're probably, outside of kind of hiking Everest or some of these really high mountains, you probably don't have a more unique demand on the human body. It's just so different. We don't deal with G's. You can't train for G's in the same way that you can train for other sports. You can't go out to a field and run around. You can't go on a court for basketball.
Right.
So G's are such an interesting demand, and they're such a unique challenge to the body. And one of the real reasons for that is because when you're pulling G's, blood is taking, the force of gravity is taking all the blood away from your brain. And that's actually the reason why we pass out. It's not because going to the heart, it's because you can't get blood to the brain. And so that's when you're dealing with G's, rather, and you get 7, 8, 9 G's on these pilots, they have these techniques, the anti-G straining maneuver as an example, that'll help keep blood in the brain. How that works is basically you're occluding your blood vessels. So vessels are obviously these big tubes, your muscles clamp them down, it keeps blood in the upper part of the body, which can circulate to the brain. So all of that to say, as far as strength, you need a requisite level of strength to be able to accurately clamp down on those vessels for a repeated period of time. Because it's one thing to do it once. You go into centrifuge as an example, which I think everyone can kind of think of that picture in their head of the arm swinging around, and you work up to a lot of G's, you squeeze and hold, and then the G's end and you survive. Right. Fighter pilots have to do that repeatedly for an hour, 2 hours, and sometimes these are really hard sorties for them, but they'll go out and they'll fly, and they'll be in these high G environments, and they'll fly. They'll get refueled in the air, so they don't land, and then they do it again. So they're doing this kind of repeated anaerobic effort where, just thinking about this, you're squeezing your lower body and your core as hard as you can, and then you're relaxing. And you're doing that, say, 30 seconds out of every 5 minutes. So you're squeezing as hard as you can for 30 seconds, then you get time to rest. But picture doing that for 3 to 4 hours. That would be an extreme. That would be an extreme sortie. I want to be clear, but nonetheless, even do that for an hour would be really difficult.
Absolutely.
So all of that to say, to circle back to your question, strength becomes really important there. So it's not a size archetype, if you will, but there is a minimal level of strength that would be required because of that.
That's interesting. So kind of piggybacking off that, because you said you guys are really like pioneering and you were starting a lot of this stuff. What is the background and history of training there? You know, I think a lot of us just remember the old Top Gun movie and they're out playing beach volleyball.
Oh, yeah.
I assume there was probably a little bit more to it than that, but what kind of background and training was going on before you got there?
Yeah, love that. And what I'd like to do to answer that question is just talk people through the training in the pipeline to be a fighter pilot, because then it'll make more sense explaining kind of the training at each stage, if that's okay. So when you're becoming a fighter pilot, as far as the training itself within the Air Force, is they have different phases. So the first stage is called Undergraduate Pilot Training, called UPT. And this is where the Air Force teaches you how to fly. And no matter what you want to fly or what you're going to fly in the Air Force, whether that's a fighter jet, whether that's like C-5 or a C-17, some sort of mobility airframe, everyone starts within UPT.
Okay.
From there, the second phase of UPT, it starts with flying a T-6. And then if you're going fighter pilot, you'll transition to a T-38, which is like a little jet. So you start to get an idea. It's not like the F-16 or the F-22s that we all know and love. It's sort of a scaled down version of that, but they move to the T-38 next. And this training is about a year long. So the first stage of training is a year long, and you have 2 different airframes. For the fighter pilot route specifically, what they'll do next is they go to a phase called IFF, which is Intro to Fighter Fundamentals. And this is where they'll fly the T-38 around, that little jet, but they start to learn what it means to be a fighter pilot, because part of what you're doing is you have to fly in specific formations. You have to learn how to dogfight, which is obviously what Top Gun is known for. You're up in the air and you're flying with another jet, which is fun. So you learn that. And you also learn the culture of being a fighter pilot, which is really important. There's a lot of tradition to it, which dates back from Vietnam. So that's all part of IFF as well. And then the next stage after that is called B course. And B course is where you actually get into the jet that you're going to fly. So you get into your F-16, you get into your F-35, and you spend about a year learning how to fly that airframe, because they're all a little bit different. The technology is a little bit different. The ages on each of those jets is actually a little bit different. So you learn about flying your jet. And then from there, what you do is you go to a squadron on assignment. So you have UPT, and then IFF, and then B course, and then you're on assignment for a fighter pilot. The process of starting UPT and finishing before you get to your assignment, it's going to depend, but it's roughly 3 years. So it's actually a very long time just to like get into the squadron itself and actually start flying the jet sort of for your job, if you will. So all of that to say, with that background, human performance in the Air Force is really new. And human performance, what I mean by that is we're looking at strength and conditioning, nutrition, physical therapy, athletic training, and cognitive performance. And all of that is pretty new. So historically, say 10, 15 years ago, Air Force didn't have anything like that. So when you were a fighter pilot and you're exposed to these G's and the demands of these G's, you didn't have really anyone there to help you if you were to pull anything or you were to get hurt. And the other side of that is you had no one to prepare you. And I will explain this to people sometimes is like, imagine, this is not perfect, but imagine getting to the NFL. And at the NFL, you have no strength coaches. You've had no strength coaches on your path to the NFL. That would be ridiculous now. Like there is no elite sport. There's no sport anywhere. Even at like middle school, it's starting now. You know, so imagine having no physical preparation anywhere along the line. And then you're in this job where because of the force of G's, it's a multiplier. So on your cervical spine, you're taking 70, 80, 90 pounds potentially, and to have no preparation for that and no one there to help you when you get hurt. That's been the history of the Air Force. And to their credit, they've recognized that. And they said, hey, we need to get training for fighter pilots. And so I don't know the exact time, but I want to say 7, 8 years ago, what they started is they implemented a human performance initiative within B course, which is that second phase where you're in your jet itself.
Yep.
And they started there. It's been hugely successful. It's a great team. And I worked for the company who helped found that. So great team and a lot of interesting ways that they went about training, which I know we'll talk to and I'll get into. But all that to say, it started in B course. The Air Force then said, hey, this is great in B course. Like we've done a good job here, but let's start this in UPT, that first phase. Yeah, which makes sense, right? So that way when you show up to B course, before you actually get the G's put on you, you have some physical preparation to handle those G's. So you can build some resilience. And so that was the team that I was a part of going into Vance Air Force Base. And we helped build that human performance initiative there. And it was strength and conditioning, it was cognitive performance, and it was nutrition for us specifically. I think that may have branched out now, but that was my initial job. And so what we're trying to do there is basically lay the groundwork. And it's not that dissimilar from any introductory training age being 0 for this population. It's just pretty rudimentary, honestly, as we're teaching you basic patterns, we're teaching you basic activation, and we're just trying to get you off the ground floor of your training age. So that way, when you do get into the jet and you do get into B course, we have this really nice handoff. Again, the analogy I'll use for a more classic sport is like you start in high school, you build these good patterns, you get to college, and any collegiate strength and conditioning coach is going to love your high school coach who helped you learn the foundation. Same thing when you get to the professional level, it sort of trickles down. So that's what the Air Force is working on right now. Is it's within UPT. Now it's within B course. And then me, for my most recent role, was working within a squadron itself. So I was with all of these pilots on active assignment. So they're done with training, they're on assignment, they're flying. That's where I was located. So the Air Force now has this really nice handoff from UPT to B course to the assignment. And as we know, that's going to help drive these specific outcomes we're looking for. Also, part of the challenge and the reality of working in the military is you're dealing with a budget every year and they want to see results. So you're dealing a little bit with the understanding that like we need results. Great. Results take time. You know, like we're not going to see some of this for 10 or 15 years because we get someone who's 23 or 24 and they have all these resources at their disposal and they're staying in the military. They're not retiring at 35. They're staying until they're 40 or 45. So you get more money out of that person. You get more life. They're hurt less. So it's just a really interesting reality of working in the military is you have some competing demands sometimes, but nonetheless, that's kind of the history of where the Air Force was and where they're moving to now.
That's awesome, man. Now, I know you said that you feel like the training is maybe rudimentary, and I'm totally okay with that. I think you've listened to the show a couple times. I'm a big believer on the basics. I would love to hear, in as much detail as you're willing to share, like, what does it look like? You know, if somebody's in UPT or they're in B course, wherever they're at, I would love to hear, like, what are some of your guys' big rocks? What's your approach? How many days a week are they in the gym? You know, how are you identifying limiting factors? Like whatever you're willing to share, I would just love to know more about what that looks like. Because I think coaches that listen, they love to know what other people are doing. So I'll just let you kind of take it from there.
Great. So I love that question. If you're okay, I'd like to work backwards a little bit because I'd like to start with where we're at in the squadron and then move backwards because I think that'll help because the squadron itself is where we deal with a lot of these demands of G's long term because I'm there with them and they're on assignment.
Yes.
They're there for 3 or 4 years. And to be honest, it's top of mind because I was most recent there. So I will
Yeah,
admit that
of
bias
course.
too. But so what I'll do is I'll walk you through what we do when we get a new pilot to the squadron, how we assess them, what we'll do for training, how we build the training, and then from there we'll work backwards. So we get a new pilot into the squadron, and as part of the human performance team, it was myself and an athletic trainer. We were actually inside the squadron, so we had a gym and we had an athletic training room inside the squadron itself. And then we had flight doctors that we worked with that were in a different building, not with us, but just in a different building, but we teamed with them. So we get a new pilot into the squadron. Step one, what we do is we take a medical history, which is not dissimilar from when you go to the doctor and you give a medical history. And what we'll also do from there is we'll look at specifically their spinal health. So we'll break down each different part of their spine. We'll go through the various ranges of motion, extension, flexion, lateral flexion, rotation. And then we'll also test their spine in somewhat unique and novel ways that don't fit kind of these classic patterns, but nonetheless, you have to be able to do when you're a fighter pilot.
Sure.
After we do that, then that was more the athletic trainer will do that. Then I tend to take over from there. So I'll get them in, and I usually start by asking 2 questions to these individuals. The first one is, if I had you stand on a 24-inch or a 30-inch box, would you feel comfortable stepping off the box and landing on the ground safely? The second question I ask is, would you feel comfortable somersaulting? I don't have them do that, but the reason I ask is because it lets me know how they feel about their body. If you take someone who's young as an example, they'll do all of that. They'll sprint downhill and tumble and they feel fine. If you take someone as another extreme who's 90, they're not very comfortable doing something like that. And even if I take 2 people, they're both 25 years old, and one is not willing to do it, but they could physically get in those positions. So they could physically somersault, they could physically land and be safe. That tells me something about them as a person and how I need to approach the training for that individual. So these are just screening questions. Again, I don't make them do it, but it gives me really good insight into this is how this person feels about their body. And so this is how I need to then approach them from a coaching perspective. And so once we do those questions, then we move into basic movement patterns as far as an assessment. I don't overthink this. Can you squat? Can you lunge? RDL, pressing, pulling, pretty simple stuff. I don't cue them when they go through this. I just want to see, 1, how they move themselves, and 2, how they've been taught to move. Because even though we have this nice human performance initiative in the Air Force right now, it's not always mandatory for all different phases within B course. So B course is a year, and say it's mandatory for the first 3 months as an example. So did they stick with it? Did they not stick with it? And generally, how do they move? So we'll do that from there. And then I go into activation. So I'll have them plank as an example. And I want to know, where are you feeling the plank? Is it your core? Is it your low back? Is it your thighs? Is it your glutes? Like, what is your nervous system telling your body that it needs to fire? Fundamentally is kind of what I'm trying to learn. I'll do the same thing for glute bridges, because we get a lot of people glute bridging, feel it in their low back, or they feel it in their upper hamstring, which they mistake for their glute. So I want to know where they're coming from. How do they feel? And then I'll have them pack their shoulders, and I'll tell them, like, give me the best posture you can packing your shoulder. In classic military, they're like back and down. And what the packing the shoulder tells me, 1, again, what have they been taught about packing the shoulder? But 2, I tend to use this as an assessment for, like, how dominant are their lats? Because we'll see a lot of times, for a lot of people, the lats will attach onto the inferior angle of the shoulder blade. It'll pull the shoulder blade down. It also tends to make you a little bit more hyperextended in the low back. Because of the shoulder blade, we'll get the clavicle being pulled down. So that tells me, if I'm seeing neck dysfunction with SCM or upper trap in there, we know some of that. We know those muscles attached to the clavicle being pulled down. So we sort of work backwards, if that makes sense. So I really like that posture assessment for me, because it starts giving me an understanding of how active their lats are, just how they approach posture in general, because we do a lot of work on shoulder health because that relates so heavily to neck health. And again, just, are the lats too overactive fundamentally?
Sure.
From there, what we get to is then breathing is the next step. So I'll have them lay on their back with their legs propped up, and I just want to see how they breathe. Are they through their belly? Are they through their chest? And again, this tells me something about their breathing patterns. I'll have them breathe through their belly, and can they take a big breath in and a big breath out without, I call it the staccato, or the kind of the going out like that. So I just want to see, like, how does their breathing look? And so that for us is our assessment when we take people in right away. And as before, we use that to get an understanding of physically outside of me sort of cueing them, where are they at? It lets me know how they feel about their body. And it lets me know in some ways like how coachable they're going to be, what their personality is. Do they enjoy the session? Do they not enjoy the session? All the intangibles of being a coach. And just as a quick aside, I do think that's the one piece about being in this population that's really fun is you do get to be a coach. I think my simple definition of a coach is you know what the standard is. You know, if you reach the standard, you will be successful, and you know how to get people to that standard. And that's really fun because we're not just telling people how to work out, we're developing people. And so a lot of this assessment is, yes, the physical structures, but how are you as a person? How do you enjoy this? How do we relate together? Because we're going to be together for a long time.
Right.
And what I'll do from there is we then confer with the athletic trainer, my partner, the flight docs if necessary. And then we say, all right, what do we need to do? Like, what's the low hanging fruit with this individual? And that could completely vary. That could be mobility. That could be strength. They could have everything great and they're not willing to buy in, or they're super gung ho and we can start tomorrow. So we just confer and figure it out. And if someone is coming in with a low training age, typically less than 2 years, but for me, for a training age is, can you perform these foundational shapes and patterns unconsciously? So can you do them fast? Can you do them slow? Can you do them time under tension, which is somewhat of a coach's eye at that point, but just can you do the patterns well? If they are below that training age, so they're a young in the gym, what I'll have them do is I put all of those pilots on I call it a foundational training program. And it's all the basic shapes and rudimentary shapes and patterns, which I love as well. Like you have to be able to do those well. So we're going to squat, we're going to lunge, we're going to RDL. I have a standard for those pilots at the beginning. They need to plank, a standard plank for 2 minutes. They need the lateral plank for 1 minute. I have them do a parallel TRX row hold for 60 seconds. A couple other standards like that, but those are examples. And I just want to assess and see where they're at, because if we're done with that month and they're improving on those shapes and patterns, and sometimes because of the reality of being a pilot is that foundational program is 4 weeks long, so 1 month. Does it take them 1 month to complete that? Does it take them 8 weeks to complete that? Does it take them 12 weeks? Like, how much are they willing to show up? And once they finish that foundational program, what I'll then do is move them into the squadron training plan for the fighter pilots themselves. And that plan is really oriented around the phase of flying that the pilots are in. So they're in high G phases, low G phases. And so that training starts to be oriented around those phases of flying from there, which we can get into later. And then to backtrack, going to UPT per your first question. Yeah. So that what I just outlined was how I approached it in the squadron itself, because it was me and the athletic trainer and me as the strength coach. I had full control over what we were doing, which I like personally. And I got to know everybody's body, and I got to know them for a couple years at a time. So the cash value of having someone like me there is huge. Yes, the knowledge, but more so I know your body really well. I know your stress response. I know how you're going to approach these different workouts and how you're going to approach the jet when you're tired, when you're rested, etc. At UPT, which is a little bit different, is we have 1,000+ pilots running through this training pipeline because it's a school. And so you're just running through these stages of school. So I don't get the same level of one-on-one time that I would with the squadron. And on top of that, because there's so many people, we had 3, 4, 5 strength coaches there. So you're working as more of a team, which has its advantages and drawbacks like anything else with a greater number of people. And so what we would do within UPT is, because it wasn't mandatory, and because we found initially that having people come in to do an assessment, we just didn't get people to come in, versus when we said, hey, we have a class, just show up. We got a lot more people that way. So we didn't have the opportunity to do an assessment on everyone. What we had to do is sort of use the coach's eye when people came to class themselves to see where they were at. And so the workouts there would be very foundational, like I talked about before, kind of the beginner or rudimentary workout program I had with my squadron. And we would try and use that just to build, as before, these foundational shapes and patterns. So when we handed them off, they would be in a much better place. But what we also did is start to collect data, which was really interesting, is we had this assessment that we would use, and we tried to relate it to what we knew the demands would be in the future. So for an example, we know that fighter pilots deal with repeated anaerobic efforts for Gs. So what we would do is we would have a metronome and we would work on these isometric squats. So you'd be down at the bottom of a squat for the length of time would be 5 seconds as an example, and then pop up and then repeat it again. And could you do that for 2 minutes at half body weight or a quarter body weight as an example? And we would have the airdyne. We had a 400-meter sprint around the track for the metabolic demand, being anywhere from 1 to 2 minutes as far as these high G sorties that the pilots are a part of. So that was the approach we took with an undergraduate pilot training, some of it by necessity, just because we had so many people dealing with it. Was hard to get buy-in initially because it's so new and people don't know what human performance is. They thought we were there and like, hey, we're going to be personal trainers, which is not a knock on personal training at all. It's just, it's a different approach with human performance.
Sure. So kind of piggybacking on this, because you talked about legs. I'm just trying to think through like what are key areas that you're focusing on. So I would assume like either lower body strength or like lower body like anaerobic training, right? Like you said, like these high intensity bursts, incomplete rest, neck, what areas are you really trying to hone in and focus on? Because I think that part's really interesting too. Like anytime you work with a new population, you find out very quickly what the potential chinks in the armor are. So what are some of the areas that you guys were focusing on there?
Yeah. So with the UPT population, we were focusing on specifically on lower body strength because what data exists within the Air Force, there's surprisingly little, almost scary how little research there actually is out there on this. But what research we have that correlates really well is basically you want to be able to deadlift 1.5 to 2 times your body weight. And we know then that if you can do that, your ability to be able to pull Gs is going to be improved. That's kind of it as far as the big thing. So lower body was huge for us. And that's where we started is we would start with, started with single leg RDLs first. We could teach people how to hinge correctly and do so in a low risk environment. And then from there, we'd pull out the trap bar. We like a trap bar more than traditional barbell deadlift for this population because they're newer, less shear force on the spine, everything else. And so that's kind of how we started. So specifically low body strength and specifically occlusion strength, so a lot of isometric work for us was our focus. Within the squadron itself, what we focused on was a lot of cervical strength because with the Gs, what they're dealing with from a positional perspective. So you picture yourself in a jet and you're in the cockpit and you're flying and you're dogfighting another jet. So this is like, they call it BFM in the Air Force, but it's classic dogfighting where you're trying to get on the other jet's tail and then you can fire a missile and shoot them down. So if you think about the demands there, you're sitting down and you're turning, going up and down, right? It's a 3-dimensional space as opposed to driving a car where you go left and right. As a fighter pilot, you go up and down. You add that. So it's very different. Yes. And as you're going through that, anytime you're going to be turning or anytime you're accelerating is when Gs come on. And during these dogfighting maneuvers, you can get up to 9 Gs and sustain that. It depends on the airframe because it's not the same for all of them. But let's say you sustain it for 15 seconds as an example. And so you're not just sustaining those Gs for 15 seconds in this perfectly neutral position, which would be hard anyway. You're having to sustain that. They call it checking 6, but you're looking over your shoulder. So if you picture kind of eyes over your shoulder like that, and your thoracic spine is going to be rotated, sometimes it's flexed and sometimes it's extended. So it depends on the situation. And the same thing with your cervical spine. You could be extended and rotated or flexed and rotated, having to do those different types of positions. So that's a big challenge to try and train for, obviously, because, it's a challenge. What I found is you're trying to train to the specific demand set, but I would never, ever train really anyone other than this population in such a seated position all the time. But for this population, I feel like you have to train them in a seated position. Like that's the rule. You have to build resiliency to the demands of their specific environment, and their specific environment is seated with their spine at funky angles, basically. Yeah. And so we worked a lot with strengthening the cervical spine for that exact reason, more so when we got to the squadron itself, because we felt like within UPT, like would it be valuable to train the cervical spine in UPT? 100%. And what we felt like we were dealing with a lot, though, is a training age of 0. And we wanted to make sure that we had the foundation down first. Like, let's pack the shoulders well. Let's teach you how to foam roll. Let's teach you how to stretch. Let's teach you how to squat well. And so I'm not saying this is the right answer. This was our approach. We just felt like we needed to lay the foundation down really well. Once people get to B course, we could hand them off. They could start focusing on the cervical spine a little bit more. And then when they come to the squadron, we start hitting that hot and heavy. So we did within the squadron much more full body because we had that one-on-one time and I had full control over everything. Whereas in UPT, it's just such a different environment. So I think you have to just think about training differently.
Yeah. Okay. So when they're in the jet, right? And I'm just trying to think about what this is like, because part of the reason that I thought this whole topic was interesting is me starting to train, well, one race car driver, but when he's in the car, he's got a little bit of neck support. So when they're in the cockpit, is there any neck support at all, or do they need that freedom of movement?
Great question. No neck support at all. They need full freedom of movement.
Okay. So this is what's really interesting, because I know, again, when I'm training Jacob, we've got whatever tools, and it's almost, purely just side to side rotation. We're just resisting those forces side to side. So I'm just trying to imagine, literally like 360 degrees of freedom of movement, but then being able to stabilize within all of that and those G forces, that's got to be incredibly challenging.
Super challenging. You're exactly on the money. It's super challenging. And this, for me, to be totally upfront, was the first job where I felt like I got to really experience strength and conditioning in the wild. And what I mean by that is we have a 100% injury rate among fighter pilots, in the same way you have a 100% injury rate among NFL athletes or any elite athlete pursuing any elite sport at a high level. The neck is only so strong. You don't have the same supporting, that thoracolumbar fascia, the nature of the facet joints. When you look at your thoracic and your lumbar spine, you do not have that same support with your neck. It's fundamentally not made to support that much weight. And something I would talk to the pilots a lot about, just to help them understand that, was basically the more range of motion or the more function that a specific part of your body has, the more risk it has for getting hurt. It's just like it's your shoulder and your hip is another great example. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like the body makes trade-offs, and that's okay, but we're now making a trade-off in a way that your body cannot possibly handle. I believe this. I'd be open to have a conversation about it, but I very much believe you can have the best training in the world, and we're not there yet, but we will get closer. You can have the best training in the world for your cervical spine, and you're still going to get hurt in the jet because it's just not made to handle 90 pounds, fundamentally. And so that's something that we dealt with a lot. But going back to those positions, that's exactly right, is they have full 360 degree, every single motion that your neck can make, they would make. And even sometimes the pilots would talk about how when they're looking someone over their shoulder, is they would reach across their body and grab the cockpit and pull. So they would get excessive range of motion, more so than they would get otherwise. And again, they're doing that under 6, 7, 8 Gs. And it's pretty wild what they have to deal with. So among the injuries most commonly seen in the fighter pilot community is the spine, for an obvious reason. And again, it depends. Some people are more cervical. Some people are more lumbar when it comes to the pattern of injury that we see. Some of that depends on the airframe. Some of it also depends on the person as well. But it's a huge challenge to be able to build resiliency in a structure that's getting beat up over and over again. It's kind of like, I'll explain to people sometimes, you're in season and you're taking a sprinter, and you're in season, you're training and you're running these races as a sprinter. And at the same time, you have to improve hamstring strength as you're training as a sprinter and competing. And that would be a little extreme, but that's the right concept to think about what we're trying to do. It's a huge challenge. And it's, to be totally upfront, it's not something that I felt like I fully figured out. We knew what to do to move along the right path. But that's part of the reason for this conversation today, is we need other people to get in there and start to experiment and figure this stuff out, because it is a huge challenge.
Yeah, no, I love it. So one other thing that was really interesting to me, again, was taking this beginner's mindset to working with Jacob and working with race car drivers. I had no idea as to the metabolic demands on the sport. And so he actually wore, I think it was his whoop or something when he did one of his races. And it was crazy because you could literally see his heart rate go up for 5 minutes, and then he was at like anaerobic threshold, right? Like right there for the next 40 minutes, which
Yeah.
was mind blowing to me. You would have thought he was going out and running at a really fast pace for 45 minutes. So I'm interested. Is this something you guys looked at with your pilots as well? Like the metabolic demands when they're in the cockpit and what's going on?
Good question. So we didn't have any access. The pilots would wear a Garmin watch, which gave us, it was helpful. It was a little variable. All this biotechnology at this point is, the highs and the lows of it.
Yes.
So they would wear a watch when they were in the jet. And we found something very similar, actually, is I wouldn't say that the anaerobic threshold specifically, but, we would have, depending on the pilot, depending on the fitness, etc. But we're looking at somewhere like a 110 to a 130 or 140 average heart rate in there. So very aerobic for a long period of time. Obviously, when they're pulling Gs, that would change a lot. So the previous response about the average heart rate would be, here's an average sortie. So we're not pulling a lot of Gs. We're going out and flying in formation, working on this specific mission set. When they're pulling Gs, we obviously would see this big high and a low. And that was more of what I trained for. And part of the reason for that was because when I first got there, specifically with metabolic demands, is I would be right inside it's called the flight line. So the pilots come in off the flight line when they land and they're in all their gear. And I'd be there waiting for them once they got inside the squadron. I'd say, how do you feel? Like, tell me how that felt, because that's when I was new there and I didn't know that much about what it meant to be a fighter pilot. And all of them would say, especially when they were doing the dogfighting type of flying, they would all say the repeated anaerobic efforts were hard and they felt out of breath. We never had anything during more of the kind of quote unquote regular sorties where there was any sort of aerobic limit, if that makes sense. So they never felt like they were out of breath, never felt like they weren't fueled well for things like that. But during the high G sorties, that was definitely something that we took into account. And we would see, heart rates get up to 170, 180 because they're occluding under load, right? And so interestingly, and as you'll know, when they would release that occlusion, the heart rate would go higher because it's trying to make up for everything and get that energy back. And so we would see these big spikes, peaks and valleys. And so that's specifically what I would train them for. I really didn't work on the aerobic piece of it, meaning as far as the training they did with me, I wouldn't have specific parts of training where I'd say, hey, let's go 45 minutes on the bike or let's walk on an incline for 45 minutes. I never really did anything like that because it didn't feel like that was something they needed. And also, they're really busy. They're insanely busy with what they do. And so for me to take 45 minutes for something aerobic, whereas like I want to work on some repeated anaerobic efforts. And what I would do for them is if I knew they had these phases of flying, so when they were getting ready for a high G phase, the 2 months leading up to that, 2 or 3 months, depending on where the squadron was at, what I would do is I would work on these metabolic demands of repeated anaerobic efforts. Sometimes I was as simple as hop on the airdyne and let's go for 15 seconds. Let's go for 30 seconds and then have the appropriate amount of time as far as recovery. And as we got closer to that, what I would like to do is get on the airdyne and sprint for 30 seconds. And then let's do a farmer carry for 50 yards. And then you're going to plank for a minute. And then you're going to hold a slam ball at your chest. And the thought process there was, one, we're meeting these time demands of the high G sortie for BFM, again, anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes. On top of that, I'm trying to teach them and help their nervous system calm down from the perspective of having to breathe while you're under pressure. So that's what all the carries were for and the plank was for. As everybody knows, it sucks to have to breathe when you're tired. It's really hard to do. You just want to rest, or you start changing your breathing patterns and you get more efficient, which becomes this feedback loop. So part of the thought process for me was like, let's start training the nervous system and your breath. I heard someone say this, and I forget who, but it's been one of my favorite quotes, which is breathing control is nervous system control. And I love that. And I so fundamentally believe that. And so that was part of the thought process there. We get our metabolic demands for the time and we get this nervous system control. And then as far as the more musculoskeletal demands, being in G's fundamentally is time under tension. That's the best way to translate it to the weight room. So for the 2 or 3 months leading up to it, we would do time under tension demands specifically. So we do eccentric work, we would do isometric work, and we would start to do that muscle action in the specific positions, meaning I would have them sit down and we would do these
Yeah.
eccentric isometric. And one of my favorites was the Z-sit position, where you're on the ground, legs in front of you and torso nice and tall. And I have them hold in the goblet position at half body weight for 90 seconds or 2 minutes. So if you're 200 pounds, as an example, you're sitting on the ground, you're holding 100 pounds in the goblet position, and you maintain good posture for 90 seconds to 2 minutes. That's an example, but that's the approach I took for leading into these high G environments.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, man. And yeah, I mean, look, sitting is sport specific for what you do, right? Like that's the same thing when we train neck a lot of times with Jacob, it's, you know, it's in a seated position because that's where he's going to be when he's actually driving. So one more follow up here. Would you say most of the people are fairly fit? You know, because I know you said you didn't have to do a lot of cardio. Are most of them naturally on the fitter side, or do they take care of some of that on their own?
Good question. So the pilots who are older and who didn't come in with human performance as part of the training and like built into the experience, I would say that their fitness comes from having done the demands of the job long term, and so their body adapted to the demands of G's.
Yeah,
I would say for the younger pilots, they are more fit in the classic sense of like what we would think of as fitness, because it's built into the training that you need to be fit. Being a fighter pilot someone said, one of the guys in AIF in the squadron said to me that flying is physical. Again, best description I've ever heard of being a pilot. And so the younger pilots, they are starting to buy into like, I need to train. And on top of that, the Air Force gives them people in human performance who can help progress them. So they are more of like your classical, healthy, fit people. Maybe that's a generational thing. Maybe that's because human performance has been ingrained there. It's not to say that the older population of fighter pilots is not fit, but it's definitely more of a focus for the younger.
Yeah, I love it, man. Okay, one more kind of more just big picture question I would love to hear from you, and then we'll start to kind of pull everything together. But obviously, you worked in the military for a while. And look, I'm sure like any other environment, there's pros and cons. So I would love to hear just what the overall experience was like, and maybe what some of the good aspects were, and some of the aspects where it was maybe a little bit more of a struggle to get to do what you needed to do.
The best part about the military for me was the ability to go into a squadron and learn the culture. Outside of just doing the job itself, you get to learn a culture. Like you get to spend time with fighter pilots. And I got to spend 2.5 years in the fighter pilot world. And I went to Christmas parties and I went to some late nights with fighter pilots. And it's such a robust and rich history that they have and these traditions that they have. And you get brought into that world and you get to understand that, not just from the Top Gun perspective, which is obviously Hollywood, but that's kind of how we get insight. Because how do you know who a fighter pilot is outside of what you read a couple articles or see on the media? It's such a kind of a sequestered group in some ways. And so being given the opportunity to be a part of that group and to be part of the team I miss it. I miss it a lot.
Yeah.
You meet people there that you'll be friends with the rest of your life. And I know that I have other friends in the military who work with SEALs and other elite populations, and they feel the same way. You get to be a part of that. The other thing I really enjoyed about working with the military from our field perspective is you go into this culture and you have to build your own culture within it, which is a big challenge. The fighter pilots have a culture for sure. They have tradition.
Yeah.
And you have to go in there and respect that and understand it, understand the personality types. But you also have to have your own identity as a coach, because that's what you're there for. And that took me a little while to figure out, if I'm honest, you're really put on the line. It was just me in the squadron as far as the strength coach. It's your identity of your gym. We build culture, is our job. That's what we do. You have to go in and build that culture. And it took me a little bit to figure out how to do that. And then once you get it, obviously it becomes a little bit more self-sustaining. But that part for me personally, I love that challenge of building culture in an environment that already has a rich culture. That was really fun. The drawbacks and some of the realities to working with the military, there are things that would make this population better. These tools, getting more time to train is a classic example of that. And you don't get that all the time. One thing people don't realize about being a fighter pilot is it's a very, very hard job. Top Gun captures the tradition and the fun of it and the freedom of it really well, and that's all true. these are very, very smart people and they work very hard. And that gets missed a lot. And in going with them working really hard, they don't get time to come down and see you as much as you would like. And that's a reality. And we would collect data over time. And one of the reasons I collected data and I put attendance as a part of that was because you're working a lot with people who will be really consistent for 3 or 4 months, and then they're deployed or they go through these upgrades or something else happens. They have a kid, something else happens, and then they detrain for 3 months. So when you're picking that pilot back up again, you're not at where you left off. You have to go back to the beginning and build them back up. So there's a lot of highs and lows like that. You could view that, and I did, as also one of the fun parts of it is that everybody is at a different phase. So it really makes you be a coach. But it is frustrating sometimes because you can have great progress and that just gets shut down. And sometimes you have no control over that. The other part of working in the military, which is challenging, which is also a reality of anyone who wants to get in the military, to pay specific attention to the contract itself. Some contracts run 4 years long, but they get renewed every year. So that's not a 4-year contract. That's a 1-year contract.
1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1.
100%. That's very common. The budgets change sometimes depending on who's in office. Budgets get delayed as far as like congressionally from the president, but budgets get delayed too. When these budgets get delayed every year, you know, the federal budget gets pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. That affects you as a government contractor. So there are hard realities to working in that world, which make it really challenging. They don't outweigh the good things, but that is a part of doing what we do.
Yeah, I love it, man. Okay, friend, big question time. If you could alter the space-time continuum and give young Tyler Koch one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think a big piece of advice that I would give him is to say, stay on the path. And I think there were times for me that I wasn't sure of if I was doing the right thing or not, but it's worked out. And I feel very fortunate to have had these opportunities, but these opportunities were built on young Tyler just being willing to grind some stuff out and work 60, 70-hour weeks and move across the country and take big risks. So there's a lot of things I would change. I want to be clear, but big picture, I think I've been very fortunate to have, my wife has been a big part of this. My family's been a big part of this. I would say stay on the path, trust yourself and stay on the path because it's got me here and I feel very fortunate to be here.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Okay, last but not least, we got our lightning round. So 4 fairly short questions. Your answer can be as long or short as you like. Number 1, got to ask, you knew it was coming. How realistic is Top Gun? I mean, you've been with real fighter pilots, so how realistic is it?
Oh, that's great. Great question. I would say not very realistic because, briefly, the pilots, when they go out to fly, they brief, so they talk about what they're going to do. Then they fly, then they debrief. And for an hour of flying, 2 hours of flying, you triple that for the amount of work it takes on the front or the back end. So that part of it makes no sense. And like this, you know, interestingly, here's a note. Top Gun is for the Navy. The Air Force has their own version of Top Gun. They may not like me characterizing it like that, but so does the Marine Corps. So all of these different populations within the military have their own, and I'm biased towards the Air Force, but the Air Force's version of Top Gun is called Weapons School, and it's 6 months long. And Top Gun is not that long. And I think there's a general recognition that if you've done Weapons School in the Air Force, that is the hardest advanced school you can go to among any of them. And they're geared differently. But it's a fun movie. It captures, like I said, a lot of the fun and the excitement of a fighter pilot. But is it real? No.
Okay. See, I love hearing that, though, because, you know, of all the athletes I've gotten to work with over the years, I love asking them, hey, is this show similar to your sport? Is this realistic? And, you know, sometimes they're like, yeah, it's not bad. And then other times you're like, no, it's not. So I love hearing real insight, right? Yeah. Okay, so number 2, this is what I'm really interested in. Did you yourself ever get to go fly?
I did not. And I am so depressed about that. I feel the same way as your reaction. I did not. I would have loved to, but it never worked out.
Yeah, okay. Number 3, you talked before the show. We were talking about how you have kind of moved and now you are studying medicine. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you mentioned there that I thought was really interesting is that there's a massive contrast maybe between the way you, the people who are listening to this show and the health industry look at health and wellness versus the medical model. So could you explain that a little bit? Because I'm really intrigued by that.
Sure. So I'm in school to be a physician assistant. I'm in training for that right now. It's still relatively new, so I'll caveat that. But it's been challenging. I was talking with you before. I just had a test on anatomy on a cadaver, and identifying structures on a model, which I think all of us could do pretty well. Origin, insertion, identifying these muscles. You get into a cadaver, it is very different. It is very not
Yeah.
clean. So, but just from, yeah, to your question, which is a good one, and I appreciate you bringing it up. It seems so far to me studying medicine that when we're approaching the human body, medicine approaches the human body from a place of pathology, whereas we approach the human body from a place of health. And it's not just a different way of thinking about the body. You drive fundamentally different outcomes because in medicine, if you can
Yes.
get rid of the pathology or manage the pathology, that's kind of a win. Whereas for us, like we want to solve the problem fully. And it's
Right.
not that medicine doesn't want to do that, but it's just there's a reality of insurance, there's a reality of time, right? We're a shortage of medical workers right now. And the other piece of that, which is really interesting to me, is because we have these different approaches, I think we drive different outcomes for what we're looking for. What I mean by that is, I think if you look at the continuum of the human body, specifically from a musculoskeletal perspective, you have injury, you have rehabilitation, you have health, you have resilience, and you have performance. So you're hurt. The process of recovering from that injury is rehabilitation. Then you're healthy, so the physical structures are healed. You're building resilience, so you're less likely to get hurt in the future. And then performance is kind of this rare opportunity to organize your life around an outcome.
Yeah.
And medicine very much focuses on injury, whereas I feel like our side of the spectrum, we will do, especially later in our careers, we do a lot of rehabilitation or at least understanding that world very heavily. Obviously, health, resilience, and performance we do. But these worlds are very, very bifurcated. You know, doctors
Mm.
really don't have a good understanding of what we do. Even sometimes they think they do because they see us as like, oh, you're teaching someone how to squat. That's kind of their perspective of us. And I think our perspective of medicine is we understand its importance, I think, but we don't understand medicine. We don't reduce broken bones. We don't reduce dislocations.
Right.
We don't give injections. We don't understand pathology and mechanism of action behind specific diseases or pharmaceuticals. And so part of the reason for me to want to go to study medicine is I think there's an opportunity in our field right now, specifically the musculoskeletal space or the orthopedic space, where we can have a provider who understands all aspects of the continuum. Because right now it's just a
Mm.
handoff from one to the other. But for me,
Sure.
I want to see what we can do within medicine. Imagine if your doctor or your provider that you go to can help heal your injury. So say it's an ACL tear. So they do your surgery and they help you fix that structure. Then that same person rehabs you. Then that same person trains you for resilience. We have nothing close to that model right now. I recognize there are
Right.
realities that put a limit on that. But nonetheless, the approach of me going back to school is because I feel like I want to try and be that provider or that practitioner and see what we can do. Because I feel like there's a very big avenue to have someone like this in the space that we occupy who understands all of it. And you're going to drive better outcomes with your human performance team. You're going to drive better outcomes individually. And the goal down the road is to open up a clinic where the idea of orthopedic medicine right now is that you show up when you're broken or when you're hurt. This perspective of orthopedic medicine is you're going to come to my clinic, but my clinic is having a gym. Like that's step one, and that's the
Yeah.
focus, right? So you have
Yeah.
this gym. We're going to prevent you from getting hurt. We're going to have someone you can go through blood work with you. We're going to have a nutritionist. And yes, we're going to be there if anything comes up, but it's a fundamental shift in orthopedic medicine is not I'm broken, fix me. It's let's make sure we never get broken in the first place. And so
Yep.
this is my desire to try and be that provider and open up that type of clinic.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. I can also tell you 440 some episodes in, nobody has pulled off the word bifurcated in the
I
podcast
appreciate
before.
that.
That's a great word.
Yeah.
I love that, man. Okay, last but not least, number 4, what's next for Tyler Koch? Is it finishing school? What else? What are you working on? What are you excited about?
Yeah, school right now is definitely next for me. PA school is hard. It is,
Yeah.
I mean, it is very challenging. It's enjoyable. It's challenging. So I want to get through this. My wife is pregnant, so we're going to have a little boy,
wow.
and I'm
Okay.
thrilled. I can't wait to be a father. So that's a big one, obviously. And then I want to get into orthopedic surgery after this because I want to understand how surgery works. So I feel like to be a good provider, as we talked about, understanding the whole continuum, you need to understand surgery. It's such a big
Yeah.
part of I think we as humans in the future, we're going to be sort of replaced, if you will, all of our parts. We have hip replacement, we have knee replacement, shoulder replacement. That's not going anywhere. And then we're also going to learn biologics in the future as well. So right now we can't replace cartilage. That will change. I feel very strongly about that. We're going to figure that out. And so I want to know that piece of it to help drive some of these outcomes more towards our side of the continuum classically. So I want to get into surgery, and then I want to open up a clinic. And then after that, I'm not sure. I'll be honest with you. I love this route for me. And I also miss training people. Medicine is different, obviously. So I would love to get my hands on a couple athletes or a team and be able to take this knowledge that I've been able to acquire and really try and see how it works in practice with someone who knows everything about this continuum.
Yeah, I love it, man. Well, Tyler, this has been amazing. Awesome show. So insightful and so many unique things for people to think about. I don't know if a lot of the listeners will ever train a fighter pilot, but hopefully it's increased some interest and engagement for those people. And if nothing else, they've taken some great stuff away from it. So where can my listeners find out more about you? Are you on social or anywhere? Or where can we find out more about you?
Yeah, so I have an Instagram. It's called 2 Minute Mechanics. I will preface all of that by saying as well that I don't have a lot of time to update it because of school and it's still new. So I would ask that you bear with me, but that would be the best place to find me right now. And please feel free to reach out with questions.
Perfect. I'll make sure I get that link in the show notes. And again, Tyler, thanks for coming on, man. This was really great.
Thank you for the opportunity. This was awesome.